Hello, this is Coach Wilson, and this is Unit 7, Day 9. Today, you need to complete a journal on Native Americans. Tell me about the plight of Native Americans in the late 1800s. What are some possible problems and issues they are facing? All right, and we talked a lot about those in Day 8, so should not be much of a problem for you to get rolling on that today. So, Day 9, talking about the Gilded Age and kind of moving on into some of the more political information, I guess you could say, of this time period between 1878 and 1900. And our essential question for the day are what are some reasons for the names Gilded Age and Tragic Era for the period between 1878 and 1900? Now, it's important to note that the Gilded Age is kind of referenced with these years, but the effects and things and problems of the Gilded Age are not going to end right at 1900. Now, the Gilded Age, the name, was a term coined by Mark Twain, yep, the same writer, which implied a thin layer of glitter over a cheap base. So imagine something very cheap that someone is taking gold and sprayed on and made it look better than it is. It's kind of like if you put a bow on a pig, still a pig. Same kind of thing. The period is also known as the Tragic Era and Dreadful Decades because it was such a period of just change and economic problems, and really our country's just trying to figure out how to be a country. The best way to put it during this time is it's kind of like the United States as a teenager, and now we're in like our early 20s in this period, and we're still trying to figure out how to live life and pay bills and do everything that we need to do. The decades earned the reputation because of the government and business corruption, added with the failures of the presidents of this time to try and solve our economic problems. Essentially, they only kind of pushed it along even deeper in regards to our problems. So, laissez-faire. We already talked a little bit about this when we talked about Carnegie and Rockefeller and some of the business practices that they supported, but it just means that the government plays a limited role in economics. All right, the strongest businesses survive, and the government doesn't interfere. Okay, and that should say interference. I spelled that wrong. But government and politics specifically were very corrupt during this time. Governments gave tons of money to businesses, and we have kind of almost that resurgence of what we talked about back in American History 1 with Andrew Jackson of the spoils system. And this idea that giving money to those people who will support you and then giving them political positions, etc. Now, the parties are basically equal during this time, Democrats and Republicans, and the presidential candidates who are running for these parties are going to take very soft stands on the issues at hand. Presidents took initiative by instituting reforms for railroads and trust and uh, various other things. The problem here is that you're not going to see a huge input from any president. They're all going to kind of be just teeter-tottering on what they believe. Now, when we get past this time period and we get into Teddy Roosevelt, then you start seeing kind of a firmer stand by many of the presidents. Now, remember, Rutherford B. Hayes was president right there at the end of the Reconstruction era, kind of the kickoff to this time period in our country. And he was very, very much at the center of the money supply debate and was able to try to, advocate one way or another as to whether we were going to be on gold or silver or what our money supply was actually going to be based on. And Congress had passed this act called the Bland-Allison Act, which would have helped farmers and small businesses. The issue here is that it was going to call for the government to coin more silver, which would increase the money supply, which would also cause inflation. So what would happen here is that your big businesses would struggle because they would be losing kind of on their profit line, but your farmers and those who needed to sell things would actually be able to sell more because there would be more money in the economy. Congress passed the law, then Hayes tried to veto it because he did not support the silver coinage of silver, and then Congress vetoes Hayes anyways. And so there's just this huge debate in our country for the next 20 or 30 years, and really on past that, over whether our country is going to stay on the gold standard or we're going to move to just kind of like our money is now, which we'll talk more about later. Hayes also did not support patronage. Basically, patronage was giving jobs to those um, who had supported you, even though they probably weren't necessarily qualified. But it's kind of just like almost like the spoils system in a way. Now, James Garfield was president after Rutherford B. Hayes. Unfortunately, he was assassinated. He was assassinated by a man who was basically felt like he had been left out of this system, and that he had been looked over by Garfield. His vice president Chester A. Arthur takes over and immediately is going to work towards ending patronage. He had benefited from patronage with a high-paying job in a New York customs office early in his career, but somehow had turned against the idea of uh, being given a job because of who you know or what who you're associated with or who you support. He's also going to help pass the Pendleton Act, which three civil commissioners would have to basically classify government jobs and test applicants for fitness if they took office. So if I was going to be a president or vice president, or I was going to take a um, political appointment, I would have to basically pass this fitness test, quote unquote, for office from these civil commissioners. He also said that federal employees are not required to support campaign funds and could not be fired for political reasons. So basically saying if you did not support a political candidate, they can't fire you from your job as a federal employee just because you don't support them, which goes back to kind of the basis of patronage, giving jobs based on someone supporting you politically. In 1884, Grover Cleveland ran against James Blaine, and scandal was kind of the central issue here. Um, there was a ton of slander between the two candidates. Blaine even accused Grover Cleveland of having an illegitimate son that he ended up admitting to having, and they just went at each other very, very harshly. Cleveland ends up winning the election. He was very tight with his money, very acceptable to most business interests. But he did manage to take away some land from railroads for unfulfilled promises, so he was, good in that regards, and trying to support the regulation of these railroads as they were getting very, very big during the 1880s and getting to where they needed somewhat of a government regulator. And that's going to lead us to the ICC. So in 1869, we have Munn versus Illinois, which had ruled for state regulation of the railroads, and that the states would be responsible for making sure that they were following, certain practices fairly, whether it's how much tax was on the goods, the imports and exports on the railroad tracks, all those kinds of things. Lawyers for the railroad argued only the federal government could regulate um, commerce, and the railroad just kind of ignored that and continued with their disputed business practices. And in 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act was passed, which required rates to be fair. So now you couldn't give favor to certain businesses to support for certain businesses. The rates had to be proportional to the distance they were traveling, and the rate schedules had to be made public. So essentially, you could not uh, kind of cheat the system. You had to give everybody a fair opportunity on the railroads. It also outlawed rebates to powerful customers, so there's, your rebates to Carnegie, Rockefeller, men of that nature. And also set up the ICC, which was the Interstate Commerce Commission, which actually would try cases of railroad companies that breached this kind of contract and this act and were not following these practices as they had been set up by the ICA. Now, 15 of the 16 cases that were brought against railroads did not support the ICC. Um, and this kind of sets a precedent for private enterprise to be government regulated. Uh, and, this is a chance for our country to kind of start pushing towards some of these regulations from the government. And if you think more into the time period with um, the child labor and all of the things going on in these factories, it makes sense that the government's trying to regulate railroads as well. Now, in 1888, Benjamin Harris is elected, and he supported high tariffs and did gain quite a bit of business support. But in gaining business support, he's also going to pass the Sherman Antitrust Act, which aimed to combat restraint of trade or commerce caused by trust. So this act, especially when Roosevelt comes into office, is really going to be kind of the teeth of his um, legal prowess, if you want to call it that. But the Antitrust Act looked to break up these trusts that had been running the country. So even though Harrison had gained some business support, he's going to lose some of it with this from the bigger businesses because they need these trusts to function. Okay, these trusts are how they're making their money. Like Rockefeller, who's not only the trustee but he is the benefactor. Okay. Um, Now in 1892, Cleveland's going to come back to presidency, and because of the problems that Harrison creates with the Treasury deficit, um, and the fact that he has let the country slide into what is one of the worst depressions in U.S. history, Cleveland is, and the Democrats specifically, are kind of blamed for all of these problems in the country. Now, it's important to note that Benjamin Harrison did not do much for the country. He did not stop any of these economic problems that were, many of these railroads are already struggling. If you think back to all the strikes and all the things that are going on in the country during this time, him nor Cleveland, either one, really did a whole lot to stop these from a very productive standpoint. They both kind of just let the country flounder. And because of all the things going on, Cleveland's problems are only going to get bigger. He seemed to make everyone angry, from the people in his party to the people who are unemployed. And he's also responsible for the federal troops that stopped the Pullman strike and the sleeping car maker that we talked about the other day. And he's also going to repeal the Silver Purchase Act, which had built on the Bland-Allison Act and had helped farmers and was helping these small businesses, which is only going to further anger citizens in our country and further put more animosity towards the Democrats. Because of Cleveland, the Republicans are going to win the next two elections, and just so happens that when he goes out of office, the Depression kind of softens in 1895, 1896, and then starts to recover completely by 1901. So the Republicans basically get to claim that they fixed the economy, even though it's probably going to just kind of rebound on its own. All right, here are your three questions for today. What was the Gilded Age? Why do you believe that it was called that? What types of things did we learn today about the Gilded Age that could show why this time period was quote unquote gilded? And then who was Jacob S. Coxey? Which ignore that question. That's going to be moved on to your next set of notes. So I'll make sure I get that put on the next day of notes. But just 1 and 2 for today. And once you get done with that, make sure you get your vocabulary done. If my numbering has got off, don't worry about those either. I used to keep these numbered, but don't worry about that for now. Just make sure you get these 4 words down. Other than that, hope you have a good day and talk to you soon.